Se ve. Okay. Ready? Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Okay. First of all, I want to thank to the Mises Institute and all for you for this opportunity to talk a briefly history about the economic crisis of Venezuela that we are suffering in this moment in Venezuela. Okay? I want to start with some economic information. In this slide, we had the GDP per worker as a fraction of the GDP per worker of the United States in the 1960s. There are four countries. I want you to guess, help me in this, okay? There are four countries: Venezuela, Switzerland, Canada, and Australia. So let's start with this number. This country, in the 1960s, his GDP per worker represented the 79% of the GDP per worker of the United States of America. What do you want? Which of those four countries do you think were? Australia, Switzerland, Canada, or Venezuela? Australia, yes. Look, beautiful, beautiful country. Okay, the second is the 80% of the GDP per worker of the United States. What other country? Canada. Yes, of course. Beautiful country also. Okay? We have two more. Which country had this 83% of the GDP per worker of the United States in the 1960s? Switzerland. Venezuela had the 84% of the GDP per worker of the United States in the 1960s. And we have here a picture of our landscape, okay, the big difference. From 1950 to 1957, we enjoyed a 5.4% of economic growth, the same that enjoyed the non-Asian tigers during 1960 to 2000. Okay, with this brief economic history, we can see the current sadly situation that is common in Venezuela. Okay, when people look at these pictures and know that Venezuela was considered in the 50s an economic growth miracle more important than the German economic miracle. The best economy of Latin America, the country that received a lot of people from many countries because they wanted to live in a flourishing and a promising nation, they always asked, what or who caused the current Venezuelan crisis? The common answer to this question is this damn guy. Okay? Hugo Rafael Chavez Frias, or the Chavismo, caused the current situation. That's what the common people say. But it's not the whole truth. Okay? Of course, he will always have the inglorious responsibility of sinking Venezuela in an economic disaster because he has following and increasing the failed system applied by his predecessors, socialism. But his predecessors are culprits just like him. All governments of Venezuela are guilty of the misery that we are suffering. So, not only these men caused the current disaster, but for a better understanding, I am talking to you. I will tell you a very brief economic history of my country. From 1918 to 1957, out of 5 governments were 4 dictatorships. But Venezuela enjoyed relative economic freedom. The oil race started and we had not state-owned oil companies. The state obtained a rent from taxes. The marginal tax rate on individual income was only 12%. The consolidated public sector absorbed 22% of the GDP and was mostly spent in infrastructure. The overall fiscal budget was generally in surplus. We had a not complete free international trade, but despite we had tariffs, we had no barriers, high taxes on anti-dumping laws. But the minority that wanted the power, the minority people that wanted the power, started to promote a change in the political arena. Venezuelans started to hear communists saying the most important freedom is the political. With democracy, we will be better than now. And as Venezuelans enjoyed a relatively high economic freedom, they changed the economic freedom for political freedom. At this point, I want to introduce Luis Cirocco. He's the other founder director of Econitech. He had to be here with me. But the tyranny with its bureaucratic system made it impossible to solve some problems with this Venezuelan passport.
In Venezuela, it's common to underestimate the damage inflicted by socialism under the 40 years preceding Chavez and Maduro's advent to power, and just blame the radical form of socialism called the revolution of the 21st century as the root cause of the crisis. But contrary to what political and economic elites benefiting from dreadful democratic institutions disseminate, an analysis of some historical facts points in the right direction. Socialism, either in its extreme or lighter versions, never ever works. When the dictatorship of Marcos Pérez Jiménez was overthrown in 1958, a democratic political scenario was established. From that moment up to 1998, 2 parties alternated in power: AD, which was the Social Democrat Party, and COPEI, the Christian social counterpart. The first president democratically elected in December 1958 was Rómulo Betancourt, a communist turned into a social democrat who helped found the Communist Party in Costa Rica, for example. Under his mandate, a central planning office called Cordiplan was established, probably influenced by the apparent success that the Soviet Union was having. Income tax rate was tripled. Price, rent, and exchange controls were implemented. Government expenditures were increased. A state-owned oil company was created. The OPEC cartel was founded by one of his cabinet members, and the local currency devalued. He also redistributed large land holdings with a particular feature. New owners just received titles of use, not full ownership of the land. private property was formally and constitutionally put in jeopardy. In 1963, Raul Leone, another social democrat, consolidated the import substitution policy that ended up increasing the cost of living for Venezuelans. He also fortified the syndicated labor force in the country. 5 years later, Rafael Caldera was elected president for the first time. He not only did not reverse his predecessor's policies, but made the Venezuelan economy much more inward-looking, requiring all private companies, for instance, to have a majority ownership by Venezuelans. The first government of Carlos Andrés Pérez, starting in 1974, gave a big push to socialism again. He nationalized the oil and iron industries and established new state-owned companies financed by the high oil prices of the moment. The central bank was totally owned by the government, while it was 51% owned by it before. Its government launched into a debt rampage. Luis Herrera's mandate, following Carlos Andrés Pérez, more than doubled the external debt and implemented a notorious devaluation of the local currency in 1983, which became a recurrent policy. He also implemented exchange rate controls and spawned a substantial amount of corruption, much of which surfaced in the following government, headed by Jaime Lucinchi, who did nothing but continuing with his predecessor's dreadful policies. In 1988, Carlos Andrés Pérez was elected president for the second time. His government signed an agreement with the International Monetary Fund, and under the banner of market reforms, it continued to devalue the currency and imposed new taxes. His government liberated most prices and privatized some state-owned companies, while rent controls remained in place. He reduced tariffs in an unilateral way, but was inefficient to stop inflation, reduce the cost of doing business, and minimize uncertainties, which translated into a disillusioned sentiment. In summary, he did not implement the necessary reforms to turn the country into a real free market economy. Following Pérez's second mandate, Rafael Caldera came to power for the second time, too, and resumed many kinds of controls again. Privatizations, for example, were stopped. The economy was on an unsustainable path, and he was forced to sign another agreement with the IMF, which resulted in more inflation, devaluation, and new taxes. Finally, in 1998, populist Chavez was elected president, projecting the image of an outsider. History has proven that he did nothing but exacerbate past mistakes, because his policies and institutions just copied those of his predecessors, but magnified. His autocratic tendencies were obvious since the beginning of his mandate.
Okay, it has been very clear in his explanation of the socialist policy of the Fourth Republic that we had in Venezuela. Those policies opened the main door to the tyranny that we have in this moment. But one thing is to tell you this, other thing is prove it. I want to show this graph, okay? The real GDP per capita since 1950 to 2014. Our source of data is the Penworld table, who want to research about it. As you can see in the green line is Venezuela. Okay? From 1958 to 1980, the economic growth was very low, a little more than 1%. From 1980 to 1998, the economic growth was negative. So we have more than 5.1 of economic growth during 1950 to 1957. But when the democracy era started in Venezuela, the economic growth started to stop in reverse, up to negative. If we calculate the economic growth in the democratic era before Chavez, the economic growth of Venezuela was minus 0.27%, okay? It's important to remark that in the world since 1960 to 2000, there are only 16 economic disasters, okay, in the world. 14 in the sub-Saharan Africa. 1 Nicaragua that had a civil war, and 1 is Venezuela. We have no civil wars in that period, 1960 to 2000, sorry. We had no civil war, but we had a lot of petroleum and a bunch of socialists, communists, and mercantilists that were ruling our country, okay? Other proof of the disaster caused by the socialist and mercantilist policy before Chavez is this graph. Pay attention to the green line again, Venezuela. The real GDP per capita is a fraction of the United States real GDP per capita, okay? These graphs support the idea that the economic disaster started in 1958. In 1957, the real GDP per capita in Venezuela was almost the 50% of the real GDP per capita in the United States of America. You can see in this point, the highest point. Well, we have never had, again, this economic level because starting the democratic era in the 1958, starting to decrease our incomes in Venezuela. Comparison with the United States, okay? So the economic crisis in Venezuela started before the tyranny of the Chavistas. Of course, it was increasing with the communism that Chavez imported from Cuba. Now it's time to review the great success at the very end point of the socialism, and any kind of socialism, because sometimes we heard that social democracy is not socialism, and it's socialism. We had social democracy in Venezuela. During this point to 1999, we had social democracy and social Christianism, okay? Let's start with the international rankings. Venezuela is in almost all international rankings in the last, or close to the last spot. The World Economic Forum said that Venezuela is the worst economy in Latin America. Transparency measures the Corruption Perception Index, and the 2017 report shows that Venezuela has the highest corruption in the Americas. Even Cuba. We're more corrupted than Cuba. The economic freedom of the world, from the Fraser Institute, measures the economic freedom considering 5 areas: size of government, legal system and property rights, sound of money, freedom to trade international, and regulation. And Venezuela is the least free economy of the world. We are the last. We're worse than Republic of the Congo, Syria, Central African Republic, and Algeria. The Human Freedom Index classified Venezuela in the 158th spot of 159, just overcome by Syria. Finally, Professor Steve Hanke from the Johns Hopkins University measures the misery index, that is the sum of the unemployment, inflation, and bank lending rates minus the percentage change in the real GDP per capita. Well, Venezuela holds the inglorious spot of most miserable country for 2017, as it did in 2016, 2015, and we expect the same result in 2018. Another ranking, here in the picture, is the Doing Business Index 2017. The World Bank classified Venezuela in the 187th of 190 countries because this country has a high hostile environment for entrepreneurs. Let me give you an example. In New Zealand, you need half a day to start a new business. In Venezuela, you need almost 200 days to start a new business, okay, with all the bureaucratic system, with all the bureaucratic legal system. The quality of life in Venezuela each day is getting worse and worse. People are marked like cattle to have the opportunity to buy some food. The shortage of basic goods is increasing. In 2016, just in Caracas, the estimation of the scarcity of food was 82.8%. Now it's worse. The supermarkets have no food. The worst deplorable quality of life that is possible thanks to socialism. The Venezuelans in average have lost more than 27 pounds of weight. And not because they want. At this moment, I want to remember the examples of the last year I did here. This was the example taking the salary of a full professor. Remember that it is a professional with at least 15 years teaching or researching in a university and holds at least a bachelor, master, and a PhD. Now let's update this information, okay? Last year I explained it that in the 1980s, with 15 minutes of the salary of the professor, he can buy 2 pounds of beef, okay? In July 2017, he required 18 hours of his salary. Now, more than 1 month, just in 1 year. And the sedan, last year, maybe representing 25 years of the salary of a full professor. In July 2018, more than 200 years of salary. Okay? The minimum wage policy, I remember that was very impacted. The people was very impacted with this example. From May 1999, when the dictator Chavez started the increments in the minimum wage, to July 2017, with the tyrant Maduro, we had 38 increments in the minimum wage. In May 1999, 2.27 minimum wage represented the basic basket, and in July 2017, 5.70 minimum wage. But today, it's other than history. Just from July 2017 to July 2018, we had 6 new increments that represent 1,000, almost 2,000%. From July, I'm not including in this calculation. It's a waste of time including this. You can imagine. And now we need 77 minimum wage to buy the basic basket in Venezuela. The money, with this bill, we can buy $28 in March 2007, $0.01 in July 2017. But now, we can buy $0.00000, nothing. This bill is worthless, okay? We have heard that individuals respond to incentives. We heard this thing every day. When incentives are bad, you cannot wait for a good response. The tyranny in Venezuela has always promoted bad incentives because they need an enslaved society. For example, the CLAP, for its initials in Spanish, are boxes that have a few products of the basic basket with regulated prices. And the bonus for pregnant women, It is a monetary subsidy that the tyranny gives to pregnant women enrolled in the official party. You have just to be pregnant, okay, to obtain a minimum wage. Well, the result is not other. People became slaves of the tyranny because they need to eat. And I went to do an analysis about the pregnant because involved our girls, our young girls, okay? A girl has to study 10 semesters. In Venezuela, almost 7 years because we have a deplorable university system, okay? 7 years to graduate as an engineer. She has to study a lot of calculus, algebra, physics, etc. Complete nights studying, and maybe in 7 years, maybe, she will be hired for a minimum wage. But other girl just needs to have sex to be pregnant and obtain a minimum wage. So, we don't have to be genius to know what option is more difficult and which is more easy, okay? That is in a concentration, Chavista concentration, a little girl. I guess she's 16, 17 years old, or less, okay? That's the bad incentives of the socialism. Perhaps Venezuela has the worst health system of the world. The hospitals are in deplorable situation. It's a total misery. The more natural act, women giving birth, is a high risk and miserable, and is in a miserable situation. These pictures is in a waiting room of the hospital in Lara State. Women giving birth there because there are no beds, okay? Our children die because there are no medicines to their treatment of cancer. They deserve an opportunity of life, but the socialist is the worst assassin. A complete chaos that some people would prefer to die than suffer the miserable experience in the Venezuela's health system. And all this situation is thanks to the socialism and thanks to this tyranny that we have in this moment. A narco-terrorist tyranny. With Diosdado Cabello, for example, the cap of the big drug cartel of Venezuela. Tarek el-Aissami were known as the link between the tyranny and terrorist Islamic groups and ISIS members. Why the regime is still in the power? Because we have a military, an army, filtered by the drug trafficking, corruption, and of course, because we have sadly, a collaborationist opposition related with the regime, and a corrupted with cases as there with in the other branch. They love socialism, and Maria Corina does not love the socialism, but loves the mercantilism, okay? So we have not a real free market, pro-free market opposition in Venezuela. We have a hope, yes, we have a hope, we have a lot of people, young people that is fighting for freedom, Rumbo Libertad, Resistencia Venezuela, Movimiento Libertad Venezuela, Movimiento Libertario de Venezuela, etc., that they believe, they really believe in the free market, but it's very difficult in the situation that we have in Venezuela, okay? Really, when somebody tells you about the socialism, that socialism is very good, you have to remember these words of Bernie Sanders, okay? These days, the American dream is more apt to be realized in South America in places such as Ecuador, Venezuela, Argentina, where incomes are actually more equal today than they are in the land of Horatio Alger. I think Horatio Alger did not dream with these pictures, with this reality. Okay? You have to hear real free market promoters, the Mises Institute, a lot of economists that promotes the free market. The socialist is so assassin, is weird, so weird that you will never understand how it works. Okay? It's really the most miserable system of the world. Professor Steve Hanke, I suggest to follow him by Twitter. He's always tweeting about the situation of Venezuela. This is his last tweet. Even though 9 million of Venezuelans can only afford to eat once a day, 9 million of 30 million of Venezuela. Venezuela still ships Cuba 55,000 barrels of subsidized oil a day, costing the country 1.2 billion per year. This socialist logic is yet another example of how socialism kills. Thank you very much for your attention.